The rain came down in sheets, blurring the ancient oaks into watercolor smudges against a bruised twilight sky. From her armchair, Ilara watched the storm lash against the window panes of her small stone cottage, a place she'd rented for its magnificent isolation. She'd come here to heal, to stitch back together the frayed edges of a life unraveled by a city and a man who had promised everything and given nothing but noise. Here, the only sounds were the wind, the rain, and the frantic beat of her own heart learning to be steady again. And, of course, the silence from the house next door. The Blackwood Manor loomed on the adjacent hill, a Gothic silhouette of sharp gables and darkened windows that drank the light and gave nothing back. Her landlord, a nervous man with shifting eyes, had told her the owner was a recluse. An eccentric old money type who never, ever left the property. In the 3 months she'd lived here, Ilara had found that to be an understatement. She'd never seen him. Not once. No cars came or went. No lights flickered in the windows at night. The only sign of life was the immaculate state of the grounds, the roses pruned, the ivy trimmed back from the stone with surgical precision. It was as if the house itself were alive, tending to its own facade. But she felt him. It was a strange, unnerving hum beneath the surface of her daily life. A prickle on her skin when she worked in her garden near the wrought iron fence that separated their properties. A fleeting sense of being watched, not with malice, but with a profound, aching loneliness that resonated in the hollow spaces of her own chest. Sometimes, late at night, when she was restoring a particularly stubborn patch of oil paint on a forgotten canvas, she would glance up at the manor and feel a pull, a magnetic tether she couldn't explain. She'd seen a shadow in a high window once, a tall, masculine shape, there and then gone. Her heart had hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage, not from fear, but from a bizarre, unwelcome flicker of recognition. Tonight, the feeling was stronger than ever. The storm seemed to be a manifestation of it, a physical outburst of the tension that had been building for weeks. She hugged her knees to her chest, the wool of her sweater a scant comfort against the chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She was an art restorer. Her life was about patience, about carefully coaxing beauty back from the ravages of time. She understood the quiet dignity of things left alone. So she had left him alone. She hadn't baked a welcome casserole, or forced a cheerful introduction. She had respected the silence because, in a way, she craved it too. A sudden, sharp crack of lightning illuminated the world in a flash of stark white. And in that brief, blinding moment, she saw him. He was standing on her porch. Ilara's breath hitched. He wasn't a shadow in a distant window anymore. He was real. Tall, dressed in clothes that seemed both exquisitely tailored and impossibly out of time, a dark, high-collared coat over a simple white shirt. His hair was the color of midnight, slicked back by the rain, and his face was a study in aristocratic angles and stark planes. He was impossibly, painfully beautiful, like a figure carved from marble and sorrow. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were dark, intense, and fixed on her through the glass, filled with a desperate, ancient yearning that seemed to strip her bare. The thunder that followed was a low, guttural growl, shaking the very foundation of her cottage. She remained frozen, her mind struggling to reconcile the myth of the man who never went outside with the reality of him standing on her doorstep, being drenched by the deluge. He hadn't knocked. He was just there. Waiting. As if he knew she was watching. Slowly, as if moving through water, she rose from the chair. Her bare feet were cold against the wooden floor. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to lock the deadbolt, to call the police. He was a stranger. A trespasser. But her feet carried her forward, drawn by that inexplicable tether. The loneliness she'd felt emanating from his house now radiated from him in palpable waves, a cold fire that beckoned her closer. She stopped a few feet from the door, her hand hovering over the handle. His expression didn't change, but his eyes seemed to darken further, swallowing the dim light of her living room. He raised a hand, not to knock, but as if to press it against the glass, stopping just short. The gesture was one of reverence, of disbelief. His voice, when it came, was not a shout against the storm, but a low, resonant timbre that seemed to vibrate through the door and into the bones of her feet. It was a voice accustomed to command, yet threaded with a vulnerability that cracked her composure. "Lenora," he said, the name a ghost on the wind. Elara flinched. It wasn't her name. He took a single, hesitant step closer, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. The rain plastered his dark hair to his forehead, and a droplet traced a path down his temple like a tear. "I felt you," he murmured, his voice thick with a century of solitude. "I felt you come back. But you stayed away." He paused, and the raw, wounded confusion in his next words shattered the night. "Why did you stop visiting?" "It has been since 1894 inch." The world tilted on its axis. Elara's hand flew to her mouth, a strangled gasp caught in her throat. He wasn't just a recluse. He was mad. A beautiful, tragic, utterly insane man standing in the middle of a thunderstorm, asking a question that was over a century old. But even as her rational mind screamed it, another part of her, a deep, dormant part, stirred in recognition. The name, Lenora, echoed in a place she didn't know she had. And his eyes. God, his eyes held the impossible truth. He wasn't asking a question. He was pleading for an answer he had been waiting for his entire, impossibly long life. The storm raged around them, but the true tempest had just broken inside her chest. She stared at the man on her porch, a man who looked at her and saw a ghost from 1894, and for the first time since moving here, she was truly, terrifyingly afraid. Not of him, but of the insane, impossible part of her that believed him. Her first instinct was a primal scream of denial. She slammed the deadbolt home, the metallic click a pathetic sound against the roar of the storm, and the hammering in her own ears. Her back hit the solid oak of the door, and she slid down to the floor, her legs refusing to hold her. Mad. He was completely, utterly mad. A handsome, sorrowful face couldn't change that. He had called her Lenora. He'd spoken of 1894, as if it were last Tuesday. She stayed there for a long time, listening. The rain eventually softened to a persistent drizzle, the thunder retreating into the distant hills. There was no knock, no further pleading. Just the silence he had always kept, now amplified by the echo of his impossible words. When she finally found the courage to peek through the curtains, the porch was empty. He was gone, as if the storm had washed him away. But the chill he'd left behind seeped into the very floorboards of the cottage. Sleep was a battlefield. She was tossed on a sea of disjointed images, feelings that weren't her own. The scent of beeswax and old leather. The rustle of a heavy silk gown against her skin. The low, resonant sound of a cello playing a mournful tune. And a man's hand, cool and strong, holding hers in a waltz. She saw his face, the same face from her porch, but younger, his eyes alight with a fierce, possessive joy. He leaned in, his lips brushing her ear, whispering a name. Lenora. She woke with a gasp, the name a phantom on her own lips, her heart racing with a terror and a longing that belonged to someone else. For the next 2 days, she lived in a state of siege. She kept the curtains drawn, jumping at every creak of the old cottage. She tried to work, to lose herself in the delicate task of cleaning a 17th-century landscape, but her hands trembled. The face of the woman in the painting seemed to mock her, her painted eyes knowing. Elara found herself staring at her own reflection, searching for a stranger. Her face was her own, hazel eyes, a stubborn chin, a light spray of freckles across her nose. It was the face of Elara Vance, 28 years old, art restorer, emotional refugee. It was not the face of a Lenora from the Gilded Age. And yet, the pull was still there. A low thrum of awareness directed toward the manor. It was no longer just a vague sense of being watched, it felt like a question hanging in the air, a plea. His loneliness was a physical presence, a weight on the atmosphere. On the third day, she couldn't stand it anymore. The sun was out, painting the damp world in brilliant greens and golds. The air was clean, washed new. It felt absurd to be hiding in the dark. She forced herself into the garden, kneeling to weed a patch of lavender with more aggression than necessary. She refused to look at the manor. She would not. But the fence separating their properties loomed in her peripheral vision. It was old, the black iron shaped into elaborate, curling vines. And resting on the gatepost on his side, a single perfect, blood-red rose. It hadn't been there yesterday. It was a variety she'd never seen before, its petals the color of deep velvet, impossibly rich. It was a silent offering. An apology. An invitation. Her breath caught. She stood, wiping her muddy hands on her jeans, her resolve crumbling. This was insane. She should pack her bags. She should call her landlord and tell him his other tenant was harassing her, that he was delusional. But the memory of his eyes, the profound, soul-deep agony in them, stopped her. There was no threat in that gaze, only a terrible, unending grief. Driven by an impulse she didn't understand, she walked to the fence. The gate was unlocked. Of course it was. He never went anywhere. She didn't cross the threshold. She just stood there, her hand resting on the cool iron, and stared at the manor. It seemed different in the daylight. Less menacing, more tragic. A beautiful prison. "I am not Lenora," she said aloud, her voice surprisingly steady. The words felt like a necessary ward, a charm against the madness seeping into her quiet world. "I know." The voice came from behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. He was standing just a few feet away, on her side of the fence. He hadn't made a sound. He moved with a preternatural grace that was both elegant and deeply unsettling. Today, he was dressed more simply, in dark trousers and a grey cashmere sweater that did nothing to soften the sharp, aristocratic lines of his face. The sunlight didn't seem to touch him in the same way it touched the world around him, it slid off him, leaving him in a perpetual state of twilight. "How did you?" she started, looking back at the gate. It hadn't moved. "The boundary has always been permeable for me," he said, his voice that same low, captivating timbre. "But I cannot cross it," he gestured vaguely toward the road beyond her cottage. "Not for long." "You were on my porch," she accused, her fear making her bold. "It was a risk. One I have not taken in a very long time. I apologize if I frightened you. When the storm came, and the energy in the air was so charged, I felt you so clearly. I thought." He trailed off, a flicker of that same desperate hope and subsequent pain crossing his features. "I was mistaken. You wear her face, you carry her light, but your soul, it sings a different song. A sadder 1 inch. Elara bristled. "My soul is not your concern." A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "Forgive me. My name is Julian." "Julian Devereux," he gave a slight, courtly bow of his head. It was so out of place, so archaic, that it almost made her laugh. "I am the owner of the house you find so silent." "You're the man who thinks I'm his dead girlfriend from the 19th century, she countered, crossing her arms. The smile vanished. "She is not dead," he said, the words low and intense. "She is lost. And I was not her boyfriend, she was my betrothed. My everything. The other half of my very being." He looked at her then, his gaze dropping the polite distance and becoming searingly direct. "You have her eyes. The exact shade of moss and gold after a rain. I have spent 128 years committing them to memory. So, yes." My confusion was profound. The sheer conviction in his voice was staggering. He spoke of over a century of waiting, as if it were a matter of fact. Ilara's carefully constructed wall of rational denial began to crack. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the details. The unnerving stillness of his posture. The faint, almost imperceptible pallor of his skin, like alabaster. The way his dark eyes seemed to hold the depth of a starless night sky. He was not of this time. "What are you?" she whispered, the question escaping before she could stop it. Julian's expression softened with a deep, abiding melancholy. "I am a man under a curse, Miss Vance," he said, his use of her name sending a shiver down her spine. "I am a prisoner. And you are the first person in a very long time who has made me wish for freedom." He gestured toward the rose on the gate-post. "That is a blackwood rose. It only blooms on the estate." It was her favorite. He met her gaze again, and the vulnerability was back, a raw wound. "I would not blame you if you left. Most would. But I find myself hoping you won't." His honesty was a disarming weapon. He wasn't trying to convince her he was sane, he was laying the pieces of his impossible reality at her feet, leaving her to decide what to do with them. Her fear was still present, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now mingled with a powerful, consuming curiosity. And something else. Something that felt dangerously like empathy. She looked from his haunted, beautiful face to the grand, silent prison behind him, and she knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that she wasn't going anywhere. "My name is Ilara," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Not Miss Vance. Ilara." A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, and for a breathtaking moment, the ancient sorrow in his eyes receded. It was like watching the sun break through clouds after a long, grey winter. "Ilara," he repeated, tasting the name. "It is a beautiful song." The invitation came 2 days later. A thick cream-colored card slipped under her door while she was out for a walk. The script was an elegant, looping cursive, a style of calligraphy long dead. "Would you do me the honor of taking tea? I have a great many things I believe you deserve to see. Julian." Her mind screamed no. It was one thing to talk to him over the fence, the solid iron a tangible barrier between her world and his madness. It was another thing entirely to willingly step into that madness. Into his house. His prison. But her heart, that traitorous, curious organ, whispered yes. She was a restorer. She spent her life uncovering stories hidden beneath layers of grime and time. Julian Devereux was the most compelling mystery she had ever encountered. How could she turn away? She found herself on his doorstep at the appointed hour, her hand hesitating before the enormous brass knocker shaped like a raven. The oak door was massive, carved with intricate knotwork. Before her knuckles could even touch the metal, it swung inward on silent hinges. Julian stood there, framed in the grand, shadowed entryway. He was dressed again in timeless dark attire, but there was an air of nervous anticipation about him, a subtle tension in his shoulders. "Ilara." "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice a low vibration in the echoing space. "You have an interesting doorbell," she quipped, her attempt at levity sounding thin and reedy. He offered a small, appreciative smile. "The house is attentive." He stepped back, gesturing for her to enter. "Please." Crossing the threshold felt like stepping into another century. The air was cool and still, thick with the scent of old books, beeswax, and something else, something uniquely him, a clean, cold scent like ozone after a storm and dry, autumn leaves. A grand staircase swept upwards into darkness, and the walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow her. The house was immaculate, but it was the cleanliness of a museum, a place untouched by the messy business of living. There was no dust, but there was a palpable layer of time covering everything. He led her not to a formal sitting room, but to a vast library. Bookshelves soared 2 stories high, crammed with leather-bound volumes. A fireplace, large enough to stand in, held a crackling fire that cast dancing shadows across the room and provided the only light, aside from the grey afternoon filtering through a towering bay window. A tea service was laid out on a low table between two worn leather armchairs. "I hope you like Earl Grey," he said, his movements fluid and precise as he poured the steaming liquid into delicate porcelain cups. "It was the only kind I had." "It's fine," she murmured, sinking into one of the chairs. The leather sighed around her. She looked around the room, at the thousands of silent, waiting books. "You have a lot of time for reading," the words were out before she could stop them. He didn't take offense. He handed her a cup, his fingers brushing hers. A jolt, like static electricity, shot up her arm. His skin was cool, but not cold, and smooth as polished stone. "Time is the one thing I have in abundance," he said, his gaze holding hers. "And the one thing I would trade all of this for," he swept a hand around the magnificent room. "For a single hour of freedom." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the quiet sip of tea. It wasn't awkward. It was contemplative. Elara felt the frantic energy within her begin to settle. The house, for all its gothic gloom, was peaceful. "You wanted to show me something," she prompted gently. He nodded, setting his cup down. He rose and walked toward a section of the library that was draped in shadow. He lit a nearby oil lamp, the flame catching with a soft whoosh, and gestured for her to join him. On the wall, between two towering shelves, hung a single portrait, covered by a velvet cloth. "I keep this one covered," he said, his voice soft. "Looking at it for too long is difficult." He took a deep breath, his hand resting on the cloth. "When I saw you, standing in your garden, it was as if she had walked out of this frame and into the sun." With a slow, reverent movement, he pulled the cloth away. Elara gasped. The woman in the portrait could have been her twin. It wasn't just a resemblance, it was an exact likeness. The same hazel eyes, the same stubborn chin, the same spray of freckles. The woman, Lenora, was dressed in an opulent gown of emerald green silk, her dark hair piled high. But her expression, it was one of utter, radiant joy, a look of pure love directed at the artist. And in the lower right corner, in small, precise script, was the signature, J. Devereux, 1894. "You painted this," Elara whispered, her hand rising to her own cheek, as if to confirm her face was still her own. "I did," Julian said, his eyes fixed on the painting, his voice thick with memory. "It was the last summer. Before everything." Elara felt dizzy, the world tilting slightly. It was impossible. Genetics could explain a resemblance, but this was a carbon copy. She reached out, her fingers hovering just over the canvas, over the painted face that was hers and not hers. She could almost feel the warmth of the woman's skin, hear the echo of her laughter. A wave of vertigo washed over her, and with it came a flash of sensation, the feeling of a paintbrush trailing along her jawline, the scent of turpentine and oil, a low, loving murmur in her ear. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her head. "Are you all right?" Julian was at her side in an instant, his hand on her arm, steadying her. His touch was electric, grounding and terrifying all at once. I don't know," she stammered, shaking her head to clear it. "I felt something from the painting." His grip on her arm tightened almost imperceptibly. "What did you feel?" he asked, his voice sharp with an emotion she couldn't name. "Hope? Fear? I don't know. It was like a memory. But not mine." She looked from the portrait back to his intense, searching eyes. The rational explanations were running out, leaving only the terrifying, impossible truth. "Tell me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Tell me what happened to you. Tell me everything." Julian looked at the portrait of Lenora, a deep, aching sorrow filling his eyes. He released Elara's arm, the loss of his touch leaving her skin feeling strangely cold. He gestured back toward the armchairs by the fire, his movements slow, as if weighed down by the years he was about to recount. "It is not a short story," he warned, his voice low and somber. "You said you have an abundance of time," she replied, her own voice steadier than she felt. She sat, clutching her now cool teacup like a lifeline. He remained standing, pacing before the fire like a caged panther, the flames casting his tall frame in flickering shades of orange and black. "My family was one of the founding lines in this valley," he began. "Old blood. Old ways. We were different. Connected to the land in a way modern people would not understand. We lived long lives, and we kept to ourselves. We were guardians of a sort." "Guardians of what?" Elara asked, leaning forward. "Of a balance. Between the mundane world and the threads of magic that run beneath it like veins of silver in stone. But we were not the only ones with old blood. There were others." The Morwoods, a flicker of distaste, cold and sharp, crossed his face. They practiced a darker, more selfish art. They sought to bend the lines of power for their own gain, to dominate, not to protect. He stopped pacing and looked at her, his dark eyes boring into hers. "For generations, a truce held. We kept to our lands, they to theirs. Until Lenora. She was not of my blood, or of theirs. She was new. Her family bought the land where your cottage now stands. She was like a splash of vibrant color in a monochrome world. Full of life, of laughter. She saw the magic in the world that everyone else had forgotten." A faint, tender smile touched his lips. "And she saw me. Not as some relic from a bygone era, but as a man. We fell in love with the kind of reckless, all-consuming passion that poets write of. It was a beautiful, fleeting thing." The smile faded, replaced by a grim shadow. Ambrose Morwood saw her too. He wanted her, not for who she was, but as a prize. "A way to finally wound my family, to take something precious from the Devereux line." He courted her with grand gestures and jewels. She, of course, refused him. "Her heart was mine." Julian's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Ambrose did not take rejection well. "On the eve of our wedding, he came here, to this house. Not for a jewel of honor, but with a curse bought from a spiteful crone. He did not have the power to kill me, my own blood protected me from that. But he could do something worse." He turned to face the massive bay window, looking out at the grounds he could never leave. "He bound me. He tied my life force to this house, to this land. I can move within its boundaries, I can keep it from falling to ruin, but I cannot leave. If I cross the boundary for more than a few moments, I begin to unravel. To fade. He doomed me to watch the world go on without me. To watch everyone I ever knew grow old and die, while I remained." Elara felt a chill creep over her that had nothing to do with the drafty old house. It was a story from a fairy tale, a dark, cruel legend. But the raw pain in his voice, the centuries of contained rage and grief in his posture, made it terrifyingly real. "What happened to Lenora?" she whispered. Julian's shoulders slumped. "She was devastated. She refused to leave me. 4 years, she lived in the cottage, visiting me every day. She searched for a way to break the curse, consulting every book, every scholar, every whisper of magic she could find. She grew older, her beautiful hair turning to silver, while I remained unchanged." His voice broke, a ragged, painful sound. "Watching the love of your life wither before your eyes while you are helpless, it is a unique kind of hell, Elara." He took a shaky breath. "On her deathbed, she made me a promise. She swore her soul would not rest. She said she would find her way back to me, that love was a stronger magic than Ambrose's hate. She died in my arms, right here, in this library." He finally looked back at Elara, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. And then the silence began. Decades of it. The world changed. Wars were fought. Cities rose. I waited. I watched families move into her cottage and then move out again. Children grew up, had their own children, and passed on. And I waited. I started to believe her promise was just the beautiful hope of a dying woman. I started to despair. He took a step closer to her, his gaze intense, pleading for her to understand. And then, 3 months ago, you arrived. The moment your car came up the drive, I felt it. A flicker. A resonance in the ancient wards of this house that had been dormant for a century. It was her light. Her essence. Faint, different, but there. I thought. I hoped she had finally kept her promise. That her soul had been reborn in you. He shook his head, a look of self-recrimination on his face. It was selfish of me. Unfair. To place the weight of that expectation upon you. You are not her. You have her face, a fragment of her spirit, perhaps, but you are your own person, with your own life, your own sorrows. He looked at her with a new kind of clarity. And I am sorry, Elara. Truly sorry for frightening you, for dragging you into my long, lonely tragedy. The full weight of his story settled upon her. A man trapped in time, mourning a love lost to mortality, sustained only by a promise. A man who had looked at her and seen a ghost, a hope, and now, finally, just a woman. The protective walls around her heart, the ones she had so carefully built after her own, mundane heartbreak, crumbled to dust. Her problems felt so small, so insignificant in the face of his epic sorrow. You don't have to apologize, she said, her voice thick with emotion. She stood and walked toward him, stopping just before him. She looked up into his timeless, tragic face. No one should have to be that alone. Impulsively, she reached out and laid her hand on his arm. This time, the jolt was different. It wasn't just a spark of static. It was a wave of warmth, of energy, that flowed from her into him. She saw his eyes widen in shock, a sharp intake of breath. And in her own mind, another image flashed, brighter and clearer than before, Lenora, old and frail, pressing a kiss to Julian's hand and whispering, "My love is a key. It will not be forgotten. It will return." The sensation vanished as quickly as it came, leaving Elara breathless. Julian was staring down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face, a look of stunned wonder dawning in his eyes. "What was that?" he breathed. "What did you just do?" I don't know," she said, her heart hammering. I think Lenora left you more than just a promise.